I'm delighted to welcome you to the next installment of our Lunch Bite Object Talk series. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Today's Lunch Bite features Andrew Outten discussing a 1773 British Army list and its intriguing annotations, a rare book from our library collections that's currently on display in our exhibition Revolutionary Beginnings. Andrew is the Institute's Historical Programs Manager and develops our historical programs ranging from lunch bites and lectures like these to battlefield tours and other special programs. Before I turn things over to Andrew, be remiss if I didn't cover the usual housekeeping items for our friends joining us on Zoom. Following the lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Andrew at any point during the program by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate your question with those from our live audience. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function. One of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Andrew Outten.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for attending both here and afar this afternoon. I'm very excited to be speaking to you today about this book. As Emily mentioned, it's a 1773 British Army list from our library collections, and also featured it's featured in our current exhibition, Revolutionary Beginnings: War and Remembrance in the First Year of America's Fight for Independence. And that exhibition highlights three of the Revolution's first major battles: the Battle of Bunker Hill in Massachusetts, the Battle of Quebec in Canada, and the Battle of Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. But the exhibition also explores how we remember and memorialize those battles, which I'm going to get to a little bit later in the presentation. To give you some background, the British Army lists were first officially published by the British Army in 1740, though they were kept in one form or another beginning as early as 1702. Officially is the key word there. The Army lists contain a comprehensive list of regular, militia, or territorial officers serving within the British Army for that given year. From 1754 through 1879, the British Army published its Army list annually before they were published quarterly from 1879 through 1922. And if you were to use a British Army list, you would be able to obtain details pertaining to an officer's date of commission, any subsequent promotions that they have received or they did receive, other appointments and locations of their service, and any gallantry medals and honors they may have earned in their career. It also contains other information about the various regiments and corps that make up the British Army. All in all, it is a great way to track the career of a British Army officer. So here is the cover of our 1773 Army list that's featured in Revolutionary Beginnings. And upon first glance, you can see that it contains probably the world's longest title. And that is the title of A List of the General and Field Officers in the Several Regiments of Horse Dragoons, Foot, and on the British and Irish establishments, to which is now added an alphabetical index: the Royal Regiment of Artillery and the Corps of Engineers, the Irish Artillery and Engineers, and the Marines on full and half pay, with the dates of their commissions as they rank in each corps and in the Army, the governors, lieutenant governors, etc., of His Majesty's garrison at home and abroad, with their allowances, all the officers on half pay, and a succession of colonels with the uniforms to each regiment from the order for clothing, etc., the whole complete for 1773. So you get a lot in that, and that's exactly what you get from these Army books, as I just mentioned, these Army lists. This one was published by the printer and bookseller John Milan in Charing Cross, London, under the auspices of the British Crown. This was an official manuscript book of the Crown. And I also think it's funny that they felt the need to include the line at the bottom: all other lists are spurious, incorrect, and of no authority. So again, this is the official version. Today, you can find the British Army list from 1773 or any other year leading up to and during the Revolution in the British National Archives. But what's unique about our 1773 British Army list is that it contains several annotations that include notes on officers who later died, retired from service, received promotions, and most intriguing, officers of various regiments who were killed or wounded during the first two battles of the war, primarily at the Battle of Bunker Hill. With that, today's presentation will draw from the various annotations and the book in general to do several things. It will explore the Battle of Bunker Hill primarily from the British perspective. It will use the annotations throughout the book to not only discuss the significance of it, but also to try to gain a better understanding surrounding the provenance of the book. And it will also show how the book is used as a tool to remember the battle and the overall war. So first, let's dive in and get some background about the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place 250 years ago, this past Tuesday, since that will be the foundation of today's presentation. So shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Royal Navy's 28-gun 6th-rate frigate HMS Cerberus, along with other transport ships, sailed into Boston Harbor on May 25th, 1775. And these ships were sent from England and carried soldiers and supplies to support the British forces garrisoned within the city of Boston, who were trying to suppress a growing rebellion. One could say that HMS Cerberus was living up to its namesake, that of the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades in Greek mythology, as on board the ship were three key British officers, William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton, who were dispatched to assist General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts. By the time of their arrival, thousands of New England militia were surrounding and threatening the British garrison at Boston, and the three generals quickly began working with Gage on devising a plan to eliminate that threat as the American forces tightened their grip around the city. After deliberating, they concluded that they needed to seize the high ground around Boston before the Americans could. As John Burgoyne noted, quote, "It was absolutely necessary to become masters of these heights," end quote. Their first objective was to secure Boston to the south by fortifying Dorchester Heights. Once those outposts were established in the south, they would then secure Bunker Hill to the north on the Charlestown Peninsula. After both of those areas were secured, the British would then push out of the city to squash the rebels in the surrounding towns. Their plan was formally finalized and agreed upon on June 12th and was to be sent into motion on June 18th. Unfortunately, American intelligence was one step ahead of them. On June 15th, American leadership learned of the British plans and developed their own plan to prevent them. On June 16th, General Artemus Ward, the commander of the American forces before George Washington and at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill, ordered Colonel William Prescott and approximately 1,000 American militia to take and fortify Bunker Hill. And this was really intended to distract the British from pushing out of Boston via the Boston Neck. Arriving on the Charlestown Peninsula that same evening, Prescott and his fellow officers decided at a council of war to bypass Bunker Hill entirely. Instead, they fortified another hill to the south of Bunker Hill, later known as Breed's Hill, which put their artillery pieces in closer range of Boston and the Royal Navy ships in Boston Harbor. And this is a 1790s engraving from the Library of Congress showing a view from Breed's Hill. So this is somewhat similar to what Prescott and his men would have seen. By morning, the Americans had industriously constructed a large redoubt atop the hill, and this was adjacent to a pre-existing split-rail fence that ran down the left side of the hill towards the Mystic River, which is to the northern end of the Charlestown Peninsula. The British forces garrisoned in Boston woke up on June 17th in astonishment. The newly constructed redoubt was noticed by both Royal Navy vessels in the harbor and sentry posts within the city. Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, and Gage's June 18th plan was immediately foiled, and the Americans were now breathing down their necks. In response, beginning at 5 a.m., the British attempted to direct their artillery fire on the earthwork that was nearing the final stages of completion. The artillery fire continued throughout the morning, but most of it was ineffective as the British guns couldn't be elevated high enough to hit the redoubt. Now, under immense pressure, the British generals held another council of war to determine their response. Two plans were suggested. General Clinton urged Gage to attack the American position by assaulting from the Charlestown Neck to trap the Americans and cut off their retreat. though, since there was still the threat of additional American forces outside of Boston and the Charlestown Peninsula, Clinton's plan was ultimately rejected by the other generals as they were concerned that the attacking British force would essentially become pinned down between two enemy positions and could result in disaster. Another plan, which was suggested by General Howe, was to send a force directly across the Charles River from Boston and assault the hill from the south. This plan called for a feint at the front of the American redoubt, or a distraction, while another body attempted to maneuver around the American left. Now, Howe recognized that the American left, which was that split rail fence that I mentioned before, moving down the hill towards the Mystic River, was seemingly weak and vulnerable, so he was convinced that the American left could be turned. General Burgoyne agreed with Howe's plan, and to him, the, quote, untrained rabble would be no match for the king's, quote, trained troops. But in reality, the British rank and file soldiers were no more veterans than the Americans they were about to fight. They did have experienced officers and were trained, but this isn't the same as combat experience, as one might know. And almost all the soldiers in the British Army at that time lacked this in Boston. But in the end, it was General Howe's plan that would be executed on June 17, 1775, and he would lead it. So it took 6 hours for the British to mobilize. But as an American eyewitness noted, the Royal Navy transport boats were, quote, hurrying about with great velocity. After several trips in the longboats, Howe's forces made it across the Charles River to the eastern corner of the Charlestown Peninsula, and all were ashore by 2 p.m. While crossing, though, Howe couldn't help but notice that there were more American forces than originally estimated. Thinking they had been reinforced, he sent a dispatch to General Gage upon landing and requested additional reinforcements. While out of American musket range, Howe and his men essentially stopped and waited for those reinforcements while refreshing themselves a bit. As Howe paused, though, Colonel Prescott watched the British prepare and also sent words for reinforcements. Answering his call for reinforcements, first was Colonel John Stark and a force of New Hampshire militia. After moving across the Charlestown Neck, Stark and his men arrived at the American redoubt, but Stark quickly noticed the vulnerabilities that Howe also saw on the American left. Anticipating a potential outflanking maneuver, Stark ordered his men down the hill between the redoubt and the river to bolster the defenses. Once this task was completed, Stark immediately deployed his men behind those bolstered defenses. By 3 p.m., a British force of over 2,000 British soldiers were poised to attack the American positions. Following Howe's suggested plan, one force under the command of Brigadier General Robert Pigot would lead the British feint at the front of the redoubt, while Howe moved at the British right, or the American left, and attempted to turn their flank. And eventually, Howe would sweep in from behind and crush those within the redoubt. Now, Generals Howe and Pigot were also supported by a reserve force commanded by Major John Pitcairn, who was the British officer that led the advance party on the morning of April 19th at Lexington and Concord. So as Howe prepared to launch his attack and overtake the American left and rear, General Pigot's forces formed south of Charlestown, where they quickly became harassed by American militiamen who had taken up positions within the town and began firing at Pigot's men from homes, barns, and other outbuildings. In response, General Howe ordered British Admiral Samuel Graves to neutralize the American marksmen by firing carcasses, which essentially were an early form of incendiary bombs, into Charlestown while sending a landing party to set fire to it. As a result, Charlestown was quickly set ablaze, providing an apocalyptic backdrop to the battle that was about to ensue. General Burgoyne later reported that Charlestown was, quote, a large and noble town in one great blaze. The church steeples were great pyramids of fire above the rest. As was common in the 18th century warfare, General Howe had intended to open his assault with an artillery bombardment. Unfortunately, in their hasty mobilization, the British forces failed to supply their guns accompanying Howe on the Charlestown Peninsula with the correct caliber of ammunition, so that didn't happen. In contrast, the colonial forces had further reinforced their position with 2 pieces of artillery sent from Bunker Hill. The only artillery that would support the British that day were positioned across the Charles River and on the Royal Navy ships around Charlestown Peninsula. When the British assault commenced, Howe led the light infantry and the grenadiers in assaulting the American left flank. Previously recognizing it as being vulnerable, he expected a rather easy go at it. As his force advanced towards the split rail fence, however, you have at the same time General Pigot leading the 5th, 38th, 43rd, 47th, and 52nd Regiments of Foot, along with the Royal Marines, in a feint in front of the redoubt. Now, unfortunately for the British, they encountered tremendous difficulties as they moved across the field and up the hill, mainly caused by the unharvested hay that required them to march through waist-high grass and concealed uneven terrain and obstacles underneath consisting of a web of stone walls, split rail fencing, and marshes. General Burgoyne later wrote that, quote, Howe's disposition was exceedingly soldier-like. In my opinion, it was perfect. As his first arm advanced up the hill, they met with 1,000 impediments, from strong fences and were much exposed. As Howe's light infantry advanced towards the seemingly vulnerable American left while dodging these obstacles, Stark's men, crouching low to the ground and holding their fire to the last possible second, unleashed their first fierce volley. The approaching British soldiers, which initially consisted of the 23rd Regiment of Foot, also known as the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, subsequently suffered over 90 casualties as a result of this volley, which caused them to panic, break, and flee. Supporting the Fusiliers was the 4th Regiment of Foot, also known as the King's Own Regiment, which rushed forward while scrambling over and around the dead and wounded Fusiliers. They met the same stiff resistance as their comrades when Stark's men fired another deadly and effective volley. They, too, quickly withdrew. As Howe's forces was experiencing this, General Pigot's feint was also faltering. Attempting to trade volleys with the Americans in the redoubt, his men were completely exposed and also cut down. Both British generals were forced to fall back. But Howe attempted to regroup and re-coordinate his attack as before. He and Pigot's men were resisted and cut down. One British officer later noted, most of our grenadiers and light infantry, the moment presenting themselves, lost 3/4 and many 9/10 of their men. Some had only 8 men a company left. A civilian eyewitness watching the British troops from Boston described the initial assault by noting that they saw a large orange flash-like, a continual sheet of lightning across the American earthwork that was followed by an uninterrupted peal of thunder. Howe's attempted plan to outflank the Americans had failed, and he had to take a different approach in dislodging the Americans. So after regrouping again, he endeavored to concentrate fully on the American right, the redoubt. Before this new attack was carried out, however, Howe had requested additional troops from General Clinton in Boston, where he and Burgoyne had watched the first attack unfold and fail. Clinton, along with approximately 400 men consisting of Royal Marines, the 63rd Regiment of Foot, and 200 walking wounded that were convinced to rejoin the fight, supported Howe in his second attack. By that time, the Americans in the redoubt were in a state of jubilation, having just withstood some of the best trained soldiers in the world. Unfortunately, reality set in, as unlike the British, they did not receive any reinforcements, and they were almost completely out of ammunition. Many American historians claim that Howe's next move involved putting his men shoulder to shoulder, several ranks deep, and sending them on a, quote, Hail Mary assault up the hill, which is going to lead to a lot of British casualties, as you'll come to find out. But instead, Howe actually ordered his men to attack the redoubt by forming them up in an open order formation 6 feet apart with fixed bayonets. And this open order formation made it more challenging for the Americans to hit their intended targets. Now, Howe's forces were quickly met with another ferocious volley of musket fire and suffered significantly, but that soon fizzled out. Again, the Americans were running out of the ammunition, and the more frequent and intense volleys basically went down to virtually nothing. Now, as the British stormed the redoubt and lunged over the earthworks with fixed bayonets, fierce fighting, hand-to-hand combat broke out. Things within the redoubt became so desperate for the Americans that they began throwing rocks and sod at their British attackers as they began to break and flee. One British officer later noted, I cannot pretend to describe the horror of the scene. 'Twas streaming with blood and strewed with dead and dying men. The soldiers stabbing some and dashing out the brains of others was a sight too dreadful for me to dwell on any longer. Now, to note, this is around the time when Dr. Joseph Warren was killed, and we all know him. He's known as one of the American martyrs at Bunker Hill, and this is a scene that is iconically depicted by artist and Revolutionary War veteran John Trumbull in this engraving here. And this engraving is also featured in the exhibition, Revolutionary Beginnings, and you can go see that after this, along with the Army list. Now, along with Dr. Warren, one of the last British casualties at the Battle of Bunker Hill was Major Pitcairn, who was actually, again, leading that reserve force. So the whole British force is at the redoubt by this time. Now, the American forces had retreated and lost the fight, obviously, but they gained a momentous victory in terms of morale. They had essentially just cleaned the clocks of the attacking British forces. So again, some of the best trained soldiers in the world. Now, many historians often blame General Howe for this without fully grasping the reality of what occurred that day for the British forces. Many claim that he was too slow to act initially, unimaginative in his attack, and he was not concerned about the well-being or needs of his soldiers as he threw them against a heavily fortified position again and again while being completely exposed. First, was it possible for the British to act faster in moving against the Americans? Probably not. They had to organize boats to get their men across the Charlestown Neck, form up, and then attack. Howe was actually being, as many might claim, a little too aggressive and was actually moving as fast as an 18th century army could for the time. Now remember, the original June 18th plan was focused on the south, so essentially everything had to be shifted north before they can make any move against the redoubt. Now, second, and probably more important, was Howe's attack unimaginative in the fact that he just kept throwing wave after wave of soldiers shoulder to shoulder up against the redoubt. That, too, probably not, or a hard no. Howe recognized that the American left was initially vulnerable, and he ordered a feint and a flanking maneuver, which was a typical tactic in the 18th century. He didn't know that Stark had arrived to reinforce the American left. When his initial attack failed, he adapted, regrouped, and formed his men into open order and tried to break the American right, focusing his attack solely on the redoubt. Now, this open order formation was a newer tactic, but it was an important one, and it was one advocated by a French military theorist in one of the most important books in the late 18th century on infantry tactics. All told, Howe asserted himself as an 18th century commander who knew how to play the game by implementing multiple tactics known to seasoned military commanders and theorists of the time. In the end, he completed his objective, but it came at a massive price. The British suffered an astonishing 226 dead and 828 wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill and suffered a casualty rate of approximately 50%. Of those 1,046 casualties, 100 were commissioned officers. For an 18th century army in an engagement of this scale, 1,046 casualties were astronomically high. But more so, losing nearly 100 commissioned officers was unprecedented. Some of these officers are denoted in today's featured object, the 1773 Army List. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this Army List contains several annotations throughout it, some of which are written on the pages listing individual regiments, and they denote some of those British officers that were killed and wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, most of the annotations denoting officers lost during the battle are listed on the page of officers for the 52nd Regiment of Foot. Among those officers being killed from the 52nd are Major Arthur Williams, Major Nicholas Addison, Major William Davidson, and Captain George Amos Smith. Now, the 52nd Regiment of Foot had been in Canada since 1767 and was actually set to return to Great Britain when they were diverted to Boston in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. During the Battle of Bunker Hill, the majority of the 52nd Regiment of Foot were part of General Pigot's feint and bore the brunt of American fire as it charged directly out the American redoubt on both assaults. Now, for context, the average size of a regiment stationed in Boston in 1775 was roughly 400 men. At the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, there were less than 10 men left unscathed in the 52nd. Now, let's think about that for a second. By 1774, the regiment, which consisted of approximately 400 men, had been stationed in North America for 7 years during peace and were about to return to England, but instead were sent to Boston to maintain that peace and were nearly wiped out a year later. Now, because of the severity of its losses, the regiment the regiment's unscathed men were essentially drafted into other regiments in August of 78, and the remaining officers returned to England, and the regiment, in the end, was essentially disbanded until 1782, when it finally obtained new recruits. That's pretty devastating right there. Now, also under the command of General Pigot at the Battle of Bunker Hill was the bulk of the 5th Regiment of Foot. Now, they were positioned on the right of the 52nd Regiment of Foot during the assaults, and they had a similar experience, though they didn't suffer nearly as many casualties as the 52nd. The 5th Regiment's page also lists officers as being killed and wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. From this regiment, Lieutenant Patrick Downs was killed during the battle, while 2 more lieutenants, Benjamin Baker and Francis Maston, were wounded. A Major William Walcott is listed as died of his wounds in America, but is not associated with a specific engagement like the others on the page. Now, listed on the page for the 4th Regiment of Foot, which had elements, again, participate in the battle under Howe's initial attempt to outflank the American left, are more officers noted as being killed or wounded. However, at least one wasn't killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The 2 officers noted on this page are Lieutenants Joseph Knight and Edward Gould. Lieutenant Knight is noted as being killed at Lexington on April 19th, while Lieutenant Gould is simply noted as wounded. Now, it's not known whether he was wounded on April 19th or June 17th or another engagement, but whoever wrote it, the annotation felt it necessary to denote him as a casualty. So like the 52nd and the 5th, the 4th and 5th Regiments of Foot arrived in Boston to keep the peace in 1774. So they were all 3 of them were stationed together for quite some time. But the 4th and 5th Regiments of Foot were dispatched from England and Ireland rather than Canada. So other regiments that contain annotations throughout their listings are the 14th, 17th, 18th, 22nd, 29th, 43rd, and 49th Regiments of Foot. Although the listings for these regiments don't contain notes of any officers being casualties in battle. Instead, these annotations simply indicate promotions and a few deaths, which we can presume, based on what I will discuss shortly, are later deaths that weren't during any battle, as the other annotations specifically mention killed rather than dead. Here's an example of the 43rd Regiment's listing, showing what that looks like for this regiment and the others that I just named off. Throughout the remainder of this 1773 Army list, however, there are no other listings associated with specific regiments. So there are no annotations other than these regiments that I just listed and described before. But what's interesting, though, is that all of the listings on these various regiments that I just named were at one point stationed in Boston before or during the initial stages of the war, but some were there at different times. The 14th and 29th Regiments of Foot were both in Boston from 1768 to 1770 when they were removed after the Boston Massacre. The 14th Regiment remained scattered around the southern colonies. 2 companies were actually sent to aid Lord Dunmore at the Battle of Great Bridge in 1775, while other remnants were drafted into General Howe's army in 1776. The 29th Regiment was also moved south, but went to England in 1773 before it was returned to North America and was dispatched to Quebec in 76. Like the 52nd, the 18th Regiment was also in North America since 1767, and most of the regiment was stationed in Boston. 43rd Regiment arrived in Boston in 1774 with the 4th and 5th Regiments. This regiment also participated in the Battle of Bunker Hill under General Pigot and suffered severe casualties like the 52nd Regiment, as I described before. And these casualties consisted of approximately 20 enlisted men and 2 sergeants, 2 drummers, and 77 enlisted men wounded. Again, the average size of a regiment was around 400, so that's pretty significant. So with the annotations only written on listings of officers from the previously mentioned regiments that all have some tie to the Boston garrison, it is highly probable that whoever made these annotations was stationed in Boston at some point and could have participated either in the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, or all of them. So by now, you've probably caught on to the fact that I probably haven't mentioned a specific name or person for who's responsible for these annotations in the book. And simply put, we don't know who it was, and we probably will never know who it was. But we can use all of the annotations spread throughout the regimental listings and the remainder of the book as clues to try to find out who may have annotated it and when. In addition to the annotations on the listings of the various regiments that were at some point stationed in Boston, a section of the book that contains the bulk of the other types of annotations was the successions of all the commissioned officers serving within the British Army in 1773. So, beginning with the British Army's generals and ending with its captains, these lists provide the names of every commissioned officer, their date of commission for that rank, and the dates of commissions of their preceding ranks. It is in this section that the responsible person also crossed out the names of various officers and noted their deaths, promotions, or whether they retired from the service. For example, on the list of all the on the page listing all the generals in the British Army in 1773, most of the names are crossed out and noted as dead. This is also the case for the succession of lieutenant generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, all the way down again to captains. Now, cross-referencing these notes with some big names that made up the British leadership during the Revolution, specifically Generals Thomas Gage, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and a Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger, who, if you know anything about the Saratoga campaign, he was the one who led a British force that swept in through the Mohawk Valley to assist Burgoyne. We can at least try to ascertain when the last entries of the book were possibly made. So, when we first look at Thomas Gage, he's listed under the succession of lieutenant generals in the 1773 Army listing. And you'll notice that his name is crossed out and he is noted as being, quote, dead. General Gage passed away in 1787. Similarly, Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger is listed as such as well. Like General Gage, his name is crossed out and listed as dead. He passed away in 1793. Now, Generals Howe and Clinton remained in the Army and continued to serve. Howe served until 1803 and passed away in 1814. Henry Clinton remained in the Army and was promoted to the rank of full general in October of 1793 before being named as the governor of Gibraltar in July of 1794. But he was unable to assume that post because he passed away in December of 1795. Clinton's name is not listed as being dead, nor is it crossed out. If the person writing the annotations in the 1773 Army list was consistent with his previous annotations, which by all accounts he was, and Clinton was presumably still alive, that would place the last annotations being made sometime between the year 1793 and 1795. Another thing I also looked at closely was the handwriting throughout the book of these annotations. And although they are in different shades of ink, which indicate that the annotations were made at different times, the handwriting appears to be consistent throughout the entire book, suggesting that one person was responsible for the various annotations. So with all of this, and solely from the annotations, we can make an educated guess surrounding the provenance surrounding this book. The responsible person was a British Army officer who either received or purchased this 1773 Army list, perhaps when he received his commission. He was a career soldier stationed in Boston either before or during the American Revolution that may have participated in the battles of Lexington and Concord and or Bunker Hill. Throughout his career and the remainder of his life, he seemingly kept tabs on his fellow officers and comrades by updating his book with deaths, promotions, and resignations from service. And he made his last annotation sometime in the period of 1793 to 1795. And again, this is all coming from using the annotations as some sort of a clue. Again, could be entirely speculative, but that's what the book can tell us at least. Now, regardless, this Army list is a fascinating artifact for many reasons. It acts as an insightful primary source that gives specific information for many of the Revolution's British officers and provides evidence of the severity of the British losses at the Battle of Bunker Hill and at the outset of the war. Moreover, it also helps to add a third human dimension to a war that is often discussed in a two-dimensional way, demonstrating that it's not only a remembrance tool for us, the modern reader, but also for its contemporary owner. Now, when reading through the various annotations in the book, you can almost picture this old nostalgic soldier going back and attempting to relive and reflect on his days in the Army. It would be like any of us going through and reflecting upon an old yearbook or something like that. It's all pretty personal. So if you haven't seen it for yourselves, I encourage you all to go upstairs. It's right upstairs in the exhibition, and it's in the Bunker Hill area, obviously. For those of you attending online, I encourage you all to come and see it, along with the rest of the treasures that we have featured in the exhibition that relate to the Battle of Bunker Hill, as well as the battles of Quebec and Sullivan's Island. So you all have until January 4th, 2026. So with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to field any questions to the best of my ability.